you can probably use something like LibreOffice instead of Microsoft Office. You should learn to use the command line. How many of you have ever typed a command with the command line on Linux? I bet the rest of you think this is an old-fashioned idea. You probably think, oh, I have this pretty user interface. I can click on things. Why would I have to learn this command line? If you think that, you just don't understand your computer yet. Because there is immense power available to those who are willing to invest a little bit of energy to learn how things work underneath the graphics user interface. You should learn to use the text editor. And I don't mean over the processor. I'm talking about something that you can use to edit source code. In Linux, that might be something like VI or Emacs, the traditional choices. Or it might be my daughter's favorite, which is Gedit or something like this. It doesn't matter. You need a tool that will let you edit simple text files, not change fonts and colors and sizes and all that. And if you really want to be in control of your own computing environment, you should learn at least one programming language. I don't care whether it's something like C or Java or Perl or Python or just shell programming. But until you learn how to write programs for your computer, in some sense, you are still at the mercy of all of the other people, even nice people like me, to provide you with the limits of what you can do with your computer. And I think this is something you should try to fight against. I also think, as I've mentioned, that it's very important to be able to share what you do with your computer with other people. The first reason is that I learned a long time ago that the best way to know if you've learned something yourself is to find out whether you can teach it to someone else. I mean, maybe that's a brother or sister or your grandmother. It doesn't matter. This is an excellent way to find out if you really understand it. Can you explain it to someone else? I also think it's really important to have fun with computers. And, you know, if you're in Vallarta and you don't already understand that almost everything we do as humans is sort of fun to do together. I think that a lot of my personal success in the world of business, and you know, in 26 years at Hewlett-Packard, I went from being a bottom-level new engineer just out of college to being an executive. And in that time, my history was full of choices where I decided that collaborating was more important than competing. Sometimes in the short term, this is a problem. When someone else beats you out for something and you feel bad about it. But in the end, being helpful, sharing, and making other people more successful, in my experience, has always been the path to making me more successful. And of course, as part of sharing, I would love to think that all of you will find some way to help contribute to free software. It doesn't have to be writing a code. Obviously, I believe that if you want to truly be in control of your own computing experiences, that you should learn to write some code, and maybe something you write will be useful to others. But even just showing your friends how to use free software, or helping with some documentation, or manning a table at a conference like this to hand out information to other people are all things that you can personally choose to do to help make a better free software future. And you know, sometimes it leads you to do really interesting things. For those of you who can see the screen, this is a photo of the back ends of a rocket that I flew August a year ago. It has sort of an interesting looking paint job. It was all shiny blue before I flew it. That rocket went to Mach 2.2 on the way to 6 kilometers above ground. And air flowing over it to move fast enough to peel most of the paint off. It's kind of analogous to me to how cool things have been in the free software world. Sometimes they have really pretty paint jobs like this. But maybe it's just because we're moving fast and going very far. So let me give you a specific example. I've been trying to give you advice about how I think you can take more control of your personal computer. So let me share with you now how I have taken more control of my personal computer in a really big way. As Gabrielle mentioned, I'm one of the two owners of a little company called Centro. We design hardware for controlling the recovery of high-power rockets like the ones that have been chosen pictures of. All of our hardware designs use the Tapper open hardware lessons, which Bruce and I were both involved in helping to review and cite several years ago. All of the firmware running in the little boards in the rockets, and all of the software that we use for the ground stations is licensed under the GPL. Right? But it's not just that. What makes it captivating, what makes it appealing, and it's like it worked very hard. Every piece of software, all of the computing experience on any of those devices, manufacturing, sell, they're reliable all of the products. And make sure that they're on products and use that their environment, GPA, which requires their electronics and accidents. And of course, the other side of that, it's very hard to use those as anything for whether manufacturers don't know software. When we work with GPA, they don't care if you do it. They think we do it out of system. And it's not hard to their software is very cannot design. So say that Java was a core of my device using Windows software, that's what I used to do that. So these things are dangerous because many of us are learning to use behind these devices. These are very simple. These jobs are really expensive. You think that's the case, it seems to be how Java jar file on both. Another big challenge that I think we face is there are so many of these interfaces that many of our students and friends are amazing us. These apps interfaces that Android are using free services that are made available to us as the internet. I'm really impressed sometimes with how efficient it is. We're talking about interface, good user interfaces. I'll talk a little bit more later about why I use CUCEA, and OpenCUCEA, for example, in compromises. Because every time you are not using increasing product programs interface, we are surprised with the service. Using Magento, which is a huge piece of business ourselves, there's metadata to run information about what user interest in all of our is immensely valuable. It's kind of a combination. It helps people understand our tool called CLI, and in some ways this is on our entire website. A bit of ability to use control the data. And I think this is another example that I'll give you something that I think we have learned recently, in which I think is something that always wants to be serving in the future. Things that as it becomes more released. It's really a big question about who's your trusted data, and what are they going to do with the C and I was serving that can use no freedom with the times and use the sun now, this process called freedom class. Out of curiosity, how would you use this? So, let's talk a little bit about freedom. What do I mean by freedom in the context of I'm explaining this, I have to understand the word, I have to explain a little bit about things like how Flickr, noise, and free software are created. Some of you already understand this because what you hear. But one of the challenges of this launch is many open source applications is to develop product and what this means. It's a very simple thing. So what's the problem with this? There are people from many different economic and social backgrounds, very different interests and abilities, time together, community resources. We've never had those experiences. And the models that we've chosen is how we collaborate with each other. So that instance, the last time, the free software is always been created if you're a business, trying to use this data software, companies to manage and pay a company like is it doing the right support? Which is a company like that have no idea like this. All course, you can hire some really smart college kids and give them money to work on your constantly they will go after support. It's entirely up to you. Happening at a time when, because everyone has access to resources, everyone has the ability to understand at the lowest levels how the system works, and is sufficiently motivated to what's usually able to control it and fix that. Is that these for-profit companies find that what we've done, no master new motivation or integration exists between users and consumers of software. We've said that every user of software can be a developer. In fact, he will pay someone else to use the government to price for them. This is significant. You must give them a zero function about how the free software requirements are. And as we're talking about yesterday, no choice. The upstream maintainers of some piece of software everybody is sufficient to effort. We've always said the power of privacy control, not a copy of our software shares and take it compromise our shoulder with me after 6 shots of tequila. So this is so important. When I was listening to all the information we put into people's asses, why should we made some of this free software? Because one is that other people that lowering this barrier to entry. So maybe it's possible for anyone to become involved in developing free software meant that people we didn't even know. Free software power to create things that we couldn't even imagine. Designed some of these years of these versus being here. Because we want to have the same opportunities power rate and that's a big thing. So that if anyone working on some big company in the United States, it's entirely unsaid. In most countries and for everyone, companies stand in the difference and the take advantage of all the results that is your data. And this is a phrase that we use called the long tail contribution. And this comes from the shape of an exponential curve. In the Linux community, in the kernel development community, for example, there are thousands of contributors of patches to each release of the kernel. A small number of people contribute a lot of patches. A lot of people only contribute one patch. Which is more important? They're both important because those people who contributed one patch were fixing something that was important to them or adding a capability that did not exist before that was important to them. And they did work that no company would ever have been economically motivated to do. But all of us get to benefit from the results of all of that effort being applied to our system. And of course, for companies, it's a great opportunity in the free software world to take everything which is not helping you differentiate yourself from your competitors and reduce the cost by sharing all the development and maintenance work. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about freedom. The other side of this equation is responsibility. Let me talk a little bit about what I mean. And I'm really talking here about your personal responsibility, my personal responsibility. First of all, what does responsibility mean? It means being accountable for your own conduct. The example I like to use is, how many of you have ever had someone say, you're responsible for this, your mother is not here to clean up after you? Who is really in control of your computer? My assertion is that it's you and only you. You make choices. You decide what products to buy. You decide what applications to use. You decide what online services to participate in. Nobody is forcing you to make those choices. Okay, I understand. Sometimes you work for a company and the company says you must use Microsoft Office. Sometimes you are a student and the school says you must upload this file in a certain format. I understand these things. But again, these are choices that you have made. You have decided that working for that company and making that money is worth dealing with that piece of technology. You have decided that going to school to get an education is worth more than being upset about what file format you have to submit your work in. I think it's absolutely true that proprietary software helps other people control you, while free software helps you have more control of your computing experience. And you know, having freedom means that you have choices to make. But you have to take the responsibility for making those choices and then living with the consequences of your choices. So, how do you take responsibility? What is it that I mean that you should actually do? Well, the first thing is, in order to be responsible, you have to be educated. You have to understand the choices that are in front of you. To do this, you must pay attention. You must ask questions. Don't just follow a crowd. Don't just do something because somebody else did. In the free software world, don't be afraid to try things. The cost of entry is low. You don't have to ask permission. You don't have to pay for software. You can use almost any computer that you can find today sitting around unused as your first Linux system if you're not already using it. And hey, you're here. You're at the Festival of Software Libre. You've already made a really good choice. You should avoid hardware that requires proprietary software. This can be a real challenge sometimes for certain kinds of devices. Nowadays, it's very easy to buy desktop and laptop or notebook systems that can run Linux well. All of the major manufacturers consider it a requirement that their systems are able to work with Linux. I have a brand new machine from Samsung, and Debian installed on it and just worked. There was no complexity. It's a little different with tablets. I think we all understand the iPad. Android devices, some of them are easier to put really free software on than others. And unfortunately, it's nearly impossible to run entirely free software on phones today. The reason for this is that at least the portion of the phone that has to do with controlling the radio is regulated by our various government authorities in ways that make it really difficult for anyone to commercially produce devices that don't have some binary magic in how that works. But we can ask questions, and we can look for the best solutions, and we can try to make the right choices. As I said, it's not hard to take control of your own personal computer, a notebook or a desktop. Use Linux. Obvious, right? Use free software applications. Even if you can't use Linux, you can probably use an open source browser. You can probably use something like LibreOffice instead of Microsoft Office. You should learn to use the command line. How many of you have ever typed a command at the command line on Linux system? I bet the rest of you think this is an old-fashioned idea. You probably think, oh, I have this pretty user interface. I can click on things. Why would I have to learn this command line? If you think that, you just don't understand your computer yet, because there is immense power available to those who are willing to invest a little bit of energy to learn how things work underneath the graphics user interface. You should learn to use a text editor. And I don't mean a word processor. I'm talking about something that you can use to edit source code. In Linux, that might be something like VI or Emacs, the traditional choices. Or it might be my daughter's favorite, which is Gedit or something like this. It doesn't matter. You need a tool that will let you edit simple text files and not change fonts and colors and sizes and all of that. And if you really want to be in control of your own computing environment, you should learn at least one programming language. I don't care whether it's something like C or Java or Perl or Python or just shell programming. But until you learn how to write programs for your computer, in some sense, you are still at the mercy of all of the other people, even nice people like me, to provide you with the limits of what you can do with your computer. And I think this is something you should try to fight against. I also think, as I've mentioned, it's very important to be able to share what you do with your computer with other people. The first reason is that I learned a long time ago that the best way to know if you've learned something yourself is to find out whether you can teach it to someone else. I mean, maybe that's a brother or sister or your grandmother. It doesn't matter. This is an excellent way to find out if you really understand it. Can you explain it to someone else? I also think it's really important to have fun with computers. And, you know, if you're here in Puerto Vallarta, if you don't already understand that almost everything we do as humans is more fun to do together. I think that a lot of my personal success in the world of business, and you know, in 26 years at Hewlett-Packard, I went from being a bottom-level new engineer just out of college to being an executive. And in that time, my history was full of choices where I decided that collaborating was more important than competing. Sometimes in the short term, this is a problem. When someone else beats you out for something and you feel bad about it. But in the end, being helpful, sharing, and making other people more successful, in my experience, has always been the path to making me more successful. And of course, as part of sharing, I would love to think that all of you will find some way to help contribute to free software. It doesn't have to be writing the code. Obviously, I believe that if you want to truly be in control of your own computing experiences, that you should learn to write some code, and maybe something you write will be useful to others. But even just showing your friends how to use free software, or helping with some documentation, or manning a table at a conference like this to hand out information to other people are all things that you can personally choose to do to help make a better free software future. And you know, sometimes it leads you to do really interesting things. For those of you who can see the screen, this is a photo of the back end of a rocket that I flew August a year ago. It has sort of an interesting looking paint job. It was all shiny blue before I flew it. But that rocket went to Mach 2.2 on the way to 6 kilometers above ground. And in the process, the air flowing over it moved fast enough to peel most of the paint off. It's kind of analogous to me to how cool things have been in the free software world. Sometimes they have really pretty paint jobs like this. But maybe it's just because we're moving fast and going very far. So let me give you a specific example. I've been trying to give you advice about how I think you can take more control of your personal computing. Let me share with you now how I have taken more control of my personal computing in a really big way. As Gabrielle mentioned, I'm one of the two owners of a little company called Altus Metro. We design hardware for controlling the recovery of high-powered rockets like the ones I've been showing you pictures of. All of our hardware designs use the Tapper Open Hardware License, which Bruce and I were both involved in helping to review and write several years ago. All of the firmware running in the little boards in the rockets, and all of the software that we use for the ground stations is licensed under the GPL. But it's not just that our product is open source and open hardware. Every piece of software that we have used for designing, manufacturing, and selling all of those products is also free software. We use the GEDA tools for drawing schematics and designing printed circuit boards. We use open source compilers like GCC and SDCC for writing all of our flight software. We use OpenJDK with Swing and Android user interfaces for our ground software. This, by the way, is very interesting. I used to say that Java was a four-letter word. And of course, in English, four-letter word is not such good. But it's really quite intriguing how easy it is to write a piece of user interface software in Java. And you can actually use the same compiled Java jar file on both Linux, Windows, Mac OS, and Android just by changing the user interface portion. We use a different user interface for Android than we do for all of the others. But I'm really impressed with how efficient it is to write good user interfaces in that environment. I never would have guessed. We use FreeCAD, LibreCAD, and OpenSCAD for doing our mechanical designs. They are a 2D, 3D, and programmatic interface to create mechanical structures. I'm using Magento, which is a huge piece of open source software to run our web store. And all of our business accounting is done with a combination of GNU Cache and a tool called Ledger CLI. You can learn more about this if you want by going to our website. We document everything we do. Another example that I'll give you is something that I've personally been working on, and which I think is something you might find interesting in the future as it becomes more released and more real. And because of some of the consequences that I think we will see of the many revelations from Snowden and other things in the news, is a project called Freedom Box. Out of curiosity, how many of you use Facebook? It's okay, you can admit it. I do too. How many of you use Twitter? Yeah. What about things like Flickr or Casa? They're not quite as many. YouTube? Have you uploaded to it or just watched other people's videos? It's all about cats, right? So what's the problem with this? All of these services have brought new computing experiences to an entire community of users who never have had those experiences before. My mother gets to see photos of my children sort of instantly when things happen, even though she lives all the way on the other side of the United States. That just didn't happen before some of these services came into existence. So what's the problem? Well, in order to use these services, we are willingly handing lots of personal data over to companies to manage on our behalf. We're giving them our stories. We're giving them our photos. We're giving them our videos. We're giving them almost all of our personal artifacts. And we don't think very much about the consequences of those actions. And this is all happening at a time when, if you didn't believe it before, you should believe now that our lives, everyone on the planet's lives, are under increasing scrutiny. And what's really troubling is that these for-profit companies running these services, no matter how noble their intentions are, must operate within the legal systems of the countries in which their systems are hosted and operate. And that means that if someone from the government comes to them and legally says to them, you must give me this information about this user and tell me who all of their friends are, who all of their friends are, they have no choice but to comply. So it doesn't matter what the terms of service say. It doesn't matter what privacy control knobs they give you for only share this compromising photo of me after 6 shots of tequila with my closest friends. You must assume that all the information you put into these services may someday become much more visible to other people than who you thought about. So what we're trying to do at the Freedom Box Foundation is to create software for a personal server that runs a free software operating system and free applications designed from the beginning to create and preserve personal privacy. We want this to run on cheap, inexpensive, power-efficient computers so that people can afford to have one of these running in their house. And the reason in your house is important is that in most countries of the world, there is a substantial difference in the legal requirements for someone to come get your data and your personal objects when they are inside your house versus when you have voluntarily given them to some other company to hold on your behalf. This is an important legal distinction. If you're on the wrong end of a gun, maybe it doesn't make a difference. But if you're fighting in a legal battle, it makes a big difference. And I hope that the Freedom Box project will help to contribute to building privacy-respecting federated alternatives to many of these existing social network services. There's lots of interest in mesh networking to allow these devices with wireless interfaces to communicate directly with each other, to get around situations where your ISP doesn't want you to connect to a particular service, or your government decides that it's time to turn off the internet. And in the end, I hope that these will help people to facilitate collaboration between people who are fighting for real and important freedoms in different parts of the world. So what's going on with Freedom Box? Where is it? We've been talking about this for a while, and we're actually making lots of progress. We described a 1.0 feature set at the FOSDEM conference in February this year. Unfortunately, my personal involvement had to stop for a while in June because my house burned down, and I've been a little distracted by dealing with that. However, other people have jumped in to help take over the development, and we're very close now to something I call an O.10 preview release, which should run on all kinds of systems and be possible for people to start to play with. If you want to learn more about this project, there are a couple of places that you can go and look. And I will make sure that these presentation materials are made available through the conference website afterwards. So what is it I really want you to do? What have I been trying to explain to you today? I think it's really important that every one of you be conscious about privacy and your other freedoms in everything that you do. I completely agree with one of the points that Bruce made yesterday. We should not react to things like the Snowden revelations by clamping down everything and going 100% towards privacy and 0% towards sharing. That would not be a good result. But we must care about these topics, and we must think consciously about our personal data and what's being done with it. If you don't already have a GPG key, while you're here at the conference, it might be a good time to create one. Because there are a bunch of people like me who have very well-connected keys who would be happy to trade key signatures with you. You should always ask questions about the devices that you're considering buying. Do they run free software? even if they run free software, do they require blobs of binary support to make certain parts of the hardware work? Or is it really all free software? You should really accept personal responsibility for your own computing environment, the decisions you're making, and the consequences of those decisions. And I believe that if you take personal responsibility, you will want to use free software in every place that you can. And really, if I had to sum all of this up in one sentence, it's that I believe you should exercise your freedom. And the freedom you should really want to exercise is to collaborate with others and contribute to a better future for all of us. I believe one of the most significant ways you can do that is to contribute to free software. So with that, I thank you very much for your time and your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. I think we have at least 15 minutes for questions, so yeah, should I give you a minute? Okay, you take that one, I'll take this one. Please feel free to ask questions in your language. Our translators do an excellent job, I think.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, una pregunta que nos estamos haciendo varios es ¿qué vamos a hacer con el problema de los BIOS protegidos para instalar cuando el hardware está, es decir, hay una cruzada que tendrá que levantarse, un movimiento social que tendrá que levantarse contra el control, digamos, de BIOS, hardware, con una empresa de software?
Yeah, so there's sort of a couple of answers that I can give to this. One of them is that traditionally, many of the devices that we have used have had some kind of proprietary BIOS. And of course, that's a piece of software that we don't have much control over. And as long as we were able to think of this as software that helped us to get some free software loaded and running in the machine and we could then forget about it, it was okay. Right? I mean, we would prefer to have a free software BIOS, but there have been strong economic reasons that that just wasn't going to happen. The more recent situation is that as the industry transitions to UEFI as its BIOS, UEFI has a capability, an optional capability, to secure the boot process. It's called UEFI Secure Boot. When I was first made aware of this capability, it was because one of my counterparts at HP, who is the vice president of the UEFI forum, told me that he thought Linux people should be paying attention and should care for this. And in the end, some very interesting things have happened. One of them is that Microsoft has required that in all x86 implementations of UEFI, that there must be a switch to turn off Secure Boot if you want to be Microsoft certified. How we ended up in a situation where Microsoft is helping to ensure all the rights to run unprotected boot is an interesting and long story. If you buy me enough years, maybe I can get all the way through it. But it is true today that for all x86 systems, we have at least the option to turn this feature off. And many of the distributions are figuring out how to add the tools that are needed so that you can use this capability to ensure that the free software you want to have running on your machine is actually what booted and was run. And my belief is that if in the end we can use this kind of capability to make sure that the software we want on our machines is the only software that's running, that's potentially a good thing. It's a bad thing if some company uses that to ensure that only the software they ship with the device is what's running on it. Unfortunately, because Microsoft doesn't care much about ARM devices. All of these interesting tablets and things that may have UEFI on them and come with Windows are going to be very hard to put a different operating system on. But who cares? Who would buy a tablet running Windows anyway? Next question.
Okay. Muchas empresas tienen ahorita miedo de que les estén espiando su información y está haciendo que sea restrictivo para ellos unirse a la nube. ¿Qué se está creando en software para garantizar privacidad real para que National Security Agency no te esté espiando? Eso puede ser, ¿no? Según lo que dejes tú, la compañía que provee el servicio no tenga manera de pago o sacar.
Yeah, so unfortunately for some services like email, the only way to really completely secure an email transaction is for you to be running an email client program on your own device that has end-to-end encryption capability. For example, every email that I send ever is signed with my GPG signature. So if you get an email from me, or that says it's from me, you can tell whether I really wrote that or not. And if it's a communication I would like to keep private, which frankly is rare, the nice thing about doing almost all of my work in the open source world is I'm actually happy for people to know about almost everything that I'm working on. It's financial plans and business plans of my consulting clients like Centro that I have to be careful of. But for an application like that, really the only answer is to have end-to-end encryption of the transaction using an encryption technology that you believe you can trust. For some other kinds of services, for example, if you want to store data in a cloud, it kind of depends. If the point for putting the data in the cloud is to share it, then the only thing you're really trying to worry about is what is the scope of that sharing. And that is very hard for you to have any ultimate control over. But if your purpose for using the cloud is to store your company data, there are also encryption technologies. One of the projects I'm personally the most interested in is called Tahoe Labs, the least authority file system. It provides a layer that allows you to locally encrypt data, which is then shared into multiple cloud storage services so that you have secure, redundant access to your information, but no one other than you and your computers and your applications ever see that data in an unencrypted form. You know, another question that people ask me about this is, particularly about freedom boxes, hey, Bdale, while you're making the world safe for law-abiding people, aren't you also making it easier for the terrorists and the crooks? And the answer is, well, yes. But the problem is that if we start trying to decide who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, then we have to start trying to decide who's allowed to make that decision. And if we decide it's the government, what happens if all of a sudden you have an opinion that's contrary to theirs or unpopular? Do you find yourself all of a sudden being branded in some way? I was pretty sure for several years that if Microsoft were really in control of the US government, I would have been branded a software terrorist and never allowed back in the US. So these are complex issues. I don't always know the answers, but the reality is with these cloud services, unless you have the ability to have some kind of end-to-end encryption, you have to assume that other people have at least some theoretical access to the data. I should be clear and say that I don't think there's nearly as much successful espionage as people worry about. I'm not talking about the NSA, I'm talking about one company stealing from another company. I mean, getting access to your Google Calendar or your Gmail account without just getting your password is actually quite difficult. If you're the government and the NSA, you just ask them and they answer. But anyone else, it's actually very hard. Yeah. Another question. Oh, come on, you've got to have more questions.
Miren, acá una pregunta. Bueno, no tanto una pregunta, sino una explicación. Hace rato mencionaste que en un congreso como este es una muy buena oportunidad para intercambiar llaves de GPG. Aunque habemos varios que sabemos de lo que estás hablando, ¿podrías darnos una explicación un poquito más extensa o más bien explicar a qué te refieres cuando estás hablando de GPG para que el resto de la gente pudiera aprovechar esta oportunidad?
Yeah, so several years ago, a smart guy named Phil Zimmerman wrote a piece of software which he chose to call Pretty Good Privacy. And he named it this because he said it was probably good enough to keep your communications with your boyfriend or girlfriend away from your brother or sister, but probably not good enough to keep a determined government from looking at your communications. Over the time since then, people have enhanced and extended this program, adding different encryption algorithms and different digital signature algorithms, so that today there's a tool called the GNU Privacy Guard, or GPG, which is a really capable personal encryption and authentication tool. And the way it works is using something called public keys. These keys are really big random numbers, and each user ends up with two parts, a public part and a private part. So in order for these things to work, other people have to know which key belongs to you. And the way they know or trust that that key actually belongs to you is that you sign other people's keys. So if you look at my key and you see that, oh, someone you know has signed my key, then maybe you trust that that key really belongs to me. So you see there's no central company or government authority that controls these keys. It's individual people creating social connections with each other. So when I talk about GPG keys, these are the freely available, public, uncontrollable by any company or government keys that we can use for exchanging private, encrypted communications with each other and for signing things so that we know exactly who wrote that. So, because the goodness of these keys is related to how connected they are to other people in other parts of the world, anytime I go to a conference and I have an opportunity to trade some key signatures with important people at that conference in that part of the world, I try to do so. This increases the size, the set of connections between all of these keys, and it increases the amount of trust that we can have in the system. So if you care about your personal privacy, a really good step to take is to learn more about GPG, to create a GPG key for yourself, and to trade GPG signatures with other people. Unfortunately, the software for doing this is ugly. It is clunky. There are some good recipes on websites on the net to explain how to do this. I contributed to one of them a few years ago, so there's several out there. And it's really not that hard. But part of what we hope to accomplish with the Freedom Box project is to make it much easier and to make creating and using these keys something that my mother would be comfortable with. And she's a wonderful lady and a teacher, but not really a technologist. So this is a big challenge, but hopefully we can make this all better. But in any case, any of you who do understand GPG keys, and in particular any of you who have them, please feel free to find me before noon tomorrow when I have to leave, and I will be happy to trade GPG signatures with you. Any other questions? Good one over here.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for doing this. Happy to see you here. And I'm going to ask you a very personal question about which distro of Linux do you use and why? Really?
I started working on Debian in 1994. And it's because of this guy right here, actually. At that time, I was working on an amateur radio satellite project, designing a processor board for a GPS receiver to go on amateur radio satellite. And I had collaborators in a number of countries, other parts of the United States. And at that time, I was using a sort of commercial, but not really, version of Unix at home from a company called BSDI. And every time a new version of GCC or Bdale came out, I was the guy figuring out how to make a cross-compiler so that we could use those to write the software for this board that was going to go on the satellite. And it's, at that time, and even today, creating a cross-compiler from GCC is very complicated. So I kept a detailed notebook file with all of the cut and pasted commands I was using so I could remember next time how to do it again. And when I was done, I would package up all of the software I had built in this notebook file, and I would make it available for all of my collaborators to download. And it was a big tarball. And eventually someone explained to me that what they did was to download the tarball, unpack it, take my notebook file out, and throw the rest away. Because BSDI cost money, and my friends in Budapest and Hungary could not afford to buy it. Nor could many of my other friends who were doing this as a hobby. And they were using Linux, different kinds of Linux. So I looked around and I said, okay, I'm an idiot. I'm trying to make the work easier for my collaborators, and I'm actually not doing it. So if they're all going to use Linux, I should try it. I had, of course, been paying attention to Linux. I was a user of Linux once. I was on the mailing list when Linus first talked about Linux. But it seemed kind of like a toy for a while. But at that point, I realized that it must have become something actually useful if all of my friends were starting to use it around this project. At that time, Bruce was running a project called Linux for Hams. It was about trying to create a version of Linux for use by amateur radio operators, ham radios. And I was very involved in ham radio, and I still am. And I said, that would be the right thing to start with, because all of my collaborators on this amateur radio satellite project were amateur radio people. Now, unfortunately, I don't think Linux for Hams was ever actually finished, because Bruce decided to use Debian as the basis for Linux for Hams, and that caused him to become very involved in Debian to write some of the initial installation tools, which we don't use anymore, we did on some more things, and to do other things, and so to be leader of the project for all of these sorts of things. Yes, we wrote the Debian social contract and its associated free software guidelines, which was then also used as the basis for the open source definition. So lots of exciting stuff happening in the Debian project at that time. And I said, oh, well, I'll try to use Linux. Bruce said, if you want to help with Linux for Hams, maybe you should try Debian and tell me what you think. And the next day, I sent him a couple of patches and another program that I thought was important that wasn't part of the system yet. And he forwarded those to Ian Murdoch, who was Debian's founder and project leader at the time. And Ian said, oh, wonderful, great. Glad to have you. Welcome to the project. For those who paid any attention to Debian, you'll understand that the new maintainer processes is very different today. But those were very early days. That was before the first public release, stable release of Debian. And I've been involved continuously ever since. I've taken little breaks from time to time. I got very involved in an amateur satellite project, and for a few months I sort of backed away from the project. That was actually right around the time that Bruce left the Debian project. And then more recently, as you might imagine, that's kind of traumatic and distracting. Several things that I was hoping to have done this year have been delayed as a result. Yes, I've been continuously involved with the Debian project now since 1994. And I'm not ashamed to suggest Debian is a great distribution to people because I believe that over the long term, it has proven to be the most reliable, might be the right word, predictable distribution. Sometimes other distributions have things that are shinier, that work better on any given day. But almost everyone I know has tried some other distribution and then tried Debian and stayed with Debian. So I like to think that's a pretty good testament to it being really useful to people who are willing to invest their time to learn how to use it. And you've probably seen there's sort of a theme in my talk today. I think you should all invest a little more time in understanding and controlling your own computing environment. Any other questions? I think we're about out of time. Okay, thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much today. It's an honor to have you here. Thank you for accepting our invitation. The University of Guadalajara wants to thank you with this paper. La Universidad de Guadalajara, el Centro Universitario de Ciencias Económico Administrativas, el Centro Universitario de la Costa y Grupo Libre de Occidente otorgan la presente constancia y agradecimiento a Bdale Garbee. Thank you so much.